Thanks so much for joining us again today, Shannon.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
I'm very excited for this. As you and I both know, there are so many webinars, and the webinar could be on like the specifics of LSD and the receptors, and at the end they'll open up to Q&A, and like 50% of the questions will be, how do I become a psychedelic assisted psychotherapist, regardless of what the topic is. So I know this is a very hot area that people are wondering about, and as these substances become more decriminalized and legalized via medical models in Oregon, it's just going to become a bigger question. So thank you for coming on to discuss this with us today. And I'd love to start, Shannon, by hearing about your own therapist journey and how you became trained in this modality.
Yeah, it's a timely question for me personally, because about 2 weeks ago, I just passed my licensed marriage family therapist exam. And so I'm
Congrats.
official, legit. It was for me a 10-year cycle. So I started working at MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, in 2011, the same season that I started my master's program in integral counseling psychology at CIAS, the California Institute for Integral Studies. So this marks 2021 marks my 10-year anniversary of working with MAPS, and also marks the 10-year journey of becoming a therapist. Certainly, most therapists probably don't take that long, but I've been quite busy with MAPS, which keeps me very occupied, not always with direct clinical work. But to speak a little bit to my own training, I mean, I think it really is rooted in being trained as a psychotherapist first and foremost. Or maybe not. Maybe it goes even earlier than that, which is I've always had an interest in kind of natural healing and finding ways to work with the earth and cultivate the resources from the earth to support and sustain us and to promote healing and health and well being. And the way that that kind of manifested for me was, many bouts of veganism and raw foodism and environmental activism and um, all these different very important parts of my life. And working at a supplement company when I was 18 years old, becoming a manager of that, and then pursuing massage therapy as a career path when I was about 19, 20 years old. And it didn't take me long to kind of burn out on massage therapy, kind of in like a spa setting. And I really was craving something more to add more to my understanding of the human experience, my own and others. And so that's when I really took an interest in pursuing psychology. It was a double major in my undergrad that I had dropped. I graduated from UC Santa Cruz in cultural anthropology. Um, so that's what led me to pursue, yeah, a master's degree in counseling psychology. And I never really, at that time and looking back, still didn't feel like that was also going to be my end all be all. So I kept feeling like I'm just adding more tools to the toolbox and growing myself and myself as a human and knowing how to work with my own experiences and hopefully growing myself in services that I could offer to others. So becoming a psychotherapist was a major part of that. And I feel like I've learned and grown so much through that process and absolutely love working with clients and just the power of being in the moment with someone and their process and their vulnerability and authenticity. And to say more about the psychedelic training, it really happened, in parallel as I was doing my graduate degree in counseling psychology and working at MAPS. Ironically, I never actually thought I was going to be a psychedelic therapist. I was pursuing, training as a psychotherapist. I was interested in working with teenagers and doing groups and doing environmental eco psychology. But it was after having some of my own, profound experiences with non-ordinary states, and then learning more and more about the research with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy that I realized, there might be a pathway kind of presenting itself in front of me. And I still wasn't quite certain as I was going through those first years of my work at MAPS and my graduate program. And when I started hearing some of my professors talking about working with talk therapy clients, I would go awake for 20 years or 25 years or 30 years. There was something beautiful about that, very intimate, kind of quaint in a way, I just knew that that wasn't what I wanted to do. I didn't, my view about psychotherapy, especially then, and it's evolved a bit over the last 10 years, was really that I wanted to facilitate people in times of their greatest need, going through their own process. And as I started learning more and more about psychedelic therapy, I really saw that psychedelic medicines are helping people just in that period of time where I just need some support. I just need some insight. I just need some encouragement. I just need a little bit of perspective from the critical thought. And so I got trained in 2014 by Michael and Annie Mithofer, who initiated the first MAPS clinical trials in the US, working with human subjects. And they did a veteran study, and they did a study with female survivors of sexual abuse. And my training was in a remote island in Canada with 7 people around a living room. We had a TV with the recordings of therapy sessions that we were able to watch a little bit and pause and ask a bunch of questions. What were you doing there? Why did you do that and not that? And we did that for 5 days and lived together and ate food together. And that was how I, got part of my MDMA therapy training. And now I direct the training program, and the program's evolved a lot since then too.
Oh, that's very cool. Thank you for sharing all of your background. I love seeing how your concepts of things morphed and where you wanted to put yourself in the healing journey for others. I'm so curious at this point because, like you just talked about traditional psychotherapy, where therapists will see patients for probably an hour or so a week, but maybe every week for 20 years. Whereas in what you're doing now, you spend a significantly longer period of time with them at each time, but it may be 3 times total. And I think that's something that I'd love to start kind of near the beginning of this episode, because when people think about becoming a psychedelic assisted psychotherapist, they may not know kind of the setup of like what that actually entails, like how long you sit with the subjects, what it's like to be in there. So can you compare and contrast a little bit between the traditional therapy and what you guys actually do as psychedelic assisted psychotherapists?
Yeah. And certainly psychedelic therapists could have long-term clients. Some people who even work on the clinical trials will refer, a long-term client and see if they're eligible for the study, or will continue treating a long-term client after they receive psychedelic therapy in the study. So talk therapy certainly has an important role in psychedelic assisted therapies as well. But it is a very different treatment. And, I can speak more specifically about the MAPS protocols with MDMA-assisted therapy, but kind of across the board with psilocybin and the MDMA studies, you're typically talking about somewhere between 1 and 3 dosing sessions. And those dosing sessions are somewhere between 4 to 8 hours long and happen somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks apart. So you're talking about, 3 kind of intensive experiences over the course of a few months. So really, someone comes into the clinical trial, we get to know them pretty quickly, and then we have the course of the 3 treatment sessions, and 4 or 5 months later, we're saying goodbye to them. So it's powerful and it's really intimate. I just think of the image a lot of times of the cocoon, and when people are in, that healing space, whether they come in with a healing crisis or are completely at their wits' end with having tried so many treatments, we work together, and really the therapist and the client create this kind of cocoon, and it holds them throughout the course of that treatment. And it's a special and kind of intensive and sacred time. So it is different than seeing people every week for a long period.
And is there a difference in, I think when we had you on the last episode, you're talking about, at least for the trials you did, you're there with the patient for 8 hours. And I think, what we think about with our traditional therapists is like the patient talks and the therapist might talk and maybe give some kind of direction or something for the people to work on. How is that different? Because I think a lot of what you do, as I understand in the, MDMA and other therapy sessions, is you're mostly listening. And a lot of the time you may be there just in silence as they're having their own process. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'd say that's mostly correct. And this is also where there can be some differences between psilocybin therapy and MDMA therapy, for example, which is partly the nature of the medicines. So MDMA is called a psychedelic. It's not a classic hallucinogen. People don't typically have auditory or visual hallucinations on MDMA, whereas with psilocybin you would. So MDMA also has this quality of empathy. So it's, some people call it an entactogen, feeling goodness about, positive regard about oneself and others. And it's very relational in that regard. It has a slightly stimulating effect. So the sessions look very different than psilocybin sessions. So there can be more, talking and engagement with the therapist. And our training program really focuses a lot on the therapeutic relationship in MDMA therapy and the ways that that relationship kind of changes, deepens, becomes more complex. Transference and countertransference become more complex when you have MDMA, and just when you're going to those kinds of deep states and spending, all day with someone. And it really is intimate, even just in the format of the thing, in addition to the medicine.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hope people take that, take stock of themselves. Like I'm, a physician, we all know. And before going to medicine, I don't think we had any real idea what it was like to be that intimate with that many people, that many times a day. It's really hard without, even if you shadow, you kind of get a little feeling for it. And so this is even harder thing to shadow because at this point, there are not really, aside from the trials, any place else that you could shadow this. So I appreciate you giving this thorough description so people can start to put themselves in the mindset of like, is this a situation in which I would feel comfortable? Would I thrive in this situation? Because I know that a lot of physicians at this point are actually kind of feeling a little burnt out because they're, aside from handing a medicine and the patient walking away, there isn't necessarily things that we can often do. And here's something that they may be able to get trained in if they're feeling like I'd like a much deeper connection with my patients. Well, this may be right up their alley. And somebody else who thinks like, I don't know about my patients for 8 hours, etc., may want to reconsider. So thank you for kind of giving us that insight. Now, before we get into the MAPS specific training, I would love if you could touch on a little bit about how there are different types of, MAPS is one of many different types of training programs. And if you could talk a little bit about what you know about the differences in these.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that, but what you just said made me think of something else. Is it okay if I share?
Please.
Our hearts really go out from MAPS to nurses because I think nurses have been a wonderful model. And of course, other medical professionals who have, similarities, but my colleagues and friends who are nurses, they're on 12-hour shifts, they're working graveyards, they're doing on call, they're familiar with being with people in their most vulnerable states, kind of supporting people in their physicality as well as emotional responses. So if somebody needs to be, held or carried or physically assisted somewhere, that's typically a nurse. And I've just really come to appreciate nurses even more as we do our training program. We have a really multidisciplinary group. We have physicians and psychiatrists, and we have nurses, we have psychiatric nurses, social workers, therapists, psychologists, clergy people. I mean, you name it, and I'm sure we'll touch on that. And sometimes the people who aren't nurses wonder, how do I, sometimes people have somatic experiences. So how do I support them? Or I'm not supposed to touch people, or how do you do that? Or what's appropriate? And, having been a massage therapist, I think I have I just came in with some training around that. And so I didn't have quite as much fear built around it through my training as a psychotherapist. But really the nurses have been a great example for us of, it's all just a matter of competency. So if you have competence and it's ethical, it's for the, purpose of supporting a person and they either consent to it or it's necessary for their safety. So what you were saying about, the format of psychedelic therapy really reminded me of some of the things that especially nurses help with, like the delivery of a baby. That doesn't fit in a 45-minute hour. That can't be scheduled once a week, for years. It's an event, it happens, and it's organic. And, our mental health healing doesn't exactly fit on a 9-month schedule that we can have a due date and plan for it, but we do create these spaces so that the process has room to happen. And sometimes it happen in a couple hours, and sometimes it takes days for it to fully blossom. And we just have to be prepared to hold that space so that someone can really go through the depth of that process. people with trauma especially are really, I kind of envision, we talk about the inner healing intelligence is really just waiting for that space and that time to be able to have a complete process. And I think it's one of the beauties of having, an 8-hour session. So I just couldn't help but not share that.
No, I appreciate that, and I love that acknowledgement of nurses because same thing, they probably went into the field knowing that they have that capacity, and they may be drawn to this because of that same reason. Like, oh, here's a different way that I could use that same skill that I have of really enjoying those longer term encounters with supporting people. And so, thanks for bringing that up. I appreciate it.
Yeah, yeah. But to talk to your point about trainings, I think, MAPS has been really focused on MDMA-assisted therapy, and MAPS was founded in 1986, the year after MDMA became a Schedule I illegal substance in the US by the DEA. And really, one of the biggest missions of MAPS, although it's the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, not just MDMA, but it was really in the wake of the criminalization of MDMA that many therapists came forward, and Rick Doblin, the founder of MAPS, kind of came forward and said, if the DEA wasn't supporting us in pursuing MDMA as a potential medicine, then we have to go through the other channels, which is really FDA clinical research, which is very difficult to do with a Schedule I drug. And so our training program is really built around the decades of that experience, the MAPS experience with MDMA-assisted therapy. And MDMA, like I mentioned, has some unique qualities different from other psychedelic substances, different from psilocybin or LSD and others, and has a relational component. And really, the MAPS protocol was built off of people working prior to the criminalization of MDMA in the late 70s and early 80s. Leo Zaff and a group of psychologists in the Bay Area had been using MDMA in kind of this gray legal zone and testing it on themselves, and really found that it was a beautiful adjunct for therapy because it allowed people to have insight and perspective, to kind of curb or put into proportion their critical thoughts about themselves or other people, to suspend judgment enough to be curious about their judgment, or to have thoughts that weren't only judgmental thoughts, to be able to face things that were typically very fearful. So MAPS really, has to credit people who worked, in the gray area before MAPS was founded, and people who've continued to work in the underground since MDMA was criminalized. There are lots of training programs opening up. It's amazing. It really, speaks to the medicine in this field growing, and it's an exciting time. And as with any time of kind of exponential growth, it's a good time to kind of check on alignment and integrity about just what are the values of this group putting trainings together. What are the values of therapists pursuing psychedelic therapies? And there's no right answer to that question. I think it's a personal question of what are my values and what are the values of the people I'm engaging with. There's some amazing training programs out there. School of Consciousness Medicine, the Certificate for Psychedelic Therapies and Research by CIAS, my alma mater. Naropa just had their first course on MDMA-assisted therapy. And then there's many psilocybin trainings, certainly the research groups, USONA, Hefter, Compass, all have their own training programs as well. And so I think there's some certificate programs like School of Consciousness Medicine or CPTR at CIAS that touch on many different medicines. So their CPTR, for example, is really looking at how do we give professionals in the field of mental health and medicine enough understanding of the different kinds of psychedelic substances and their application, their potential risks and benefits, so that people can just have an awareness about the field. And CPTR has really been growing actual skills training. So we partner with them and we do a portion of the MAPS training in their certificate program.
Nice. I like that description because there are two separate things here. Like with what we focus with the Psychedelic Medicine Association, we're just telling doctors what these medicines are, but we do not get at all into the what it is like to be a trained therapist in this. We want them to know they exist and then to be able to refer to somebody. If they want to join the training, great. But I think that's a good thing to know when you're looking at training programs is are you just being trained on what the medicines are or are you being trained on the psychotherapy process itself? And
Yeah.
in that same question, like, is it for one medicine? Is it for multiple medicines? Like a few different things. Thank you for giving people like different things to look at, different aspects to examine. All right, let's hear before we get started. Okay, before we hear about the meat and potatoes of what goes on in the MAPS training program for MDMA assisted therapy, can you talk a little bit about, you said that like clergy and medical people are involved. What are the requirements for somebody to be able to apply for that program?
Yeah. So for the MAPS MDMA therapy training program, our requirements are really an amalgamation between what MAPS's stance is on base level competencies for an MDMA assisted therapy provider, as well as our negotiations with regulatory agencies. So MAPS Public Benefit Corporation is the umbrella that holds the training program. It's a for-profit public benefit corporation. Sorry, it's a public benefit corporation. So the profits all go into the mission, and it's wholly owned by MAPS, just as a little bit of background. And so we are conducting clinical research. So we're always subject to what the regulatory agencies kind of dictate about clinical trials. So FDA is really, they don't regulate psychotherapy. So they've really come to us to, in some ways, kind of educate them previously about psychedelics in general, but now about psychotherapy. So what are the qualifications for somebody who would be conducting a psychedelic assisted psychotherapy? And that's not a question that, MAPS alone can answer. And it's an interesting question because you could say, well, if you're talking about psychotherapy, then you look at the field of psychotherapy, which is well established, and you look at the competencies of that. But then it begs the question of, is psychedelic assisted psychotherapy a specialty within psychotherapy, or is it a thing in and of itself? And I think we're still, as a field, kind of pondering all of that. And so there are, groups of people who've been thinking about this for years and kind of coming across organizations to really ideate what the future of this field might be. Certainly the easiest thing for us to do, both as a clinical trial sponsor and as a clinical training program, is to lean on the field of psychotherapy and mental health, which is well established and has way more resources than MAPS has, to say, these are clinical training programs that give people the competency to practice psychotherapy. These are the licenses. So that's our easiest case example, is someone who's licensed to practice psychotherapy. So that's typically who comes to our training program. But we also believe that we have an opportunity, and it's kind of in the nature of peer mental health support in a way, that there are lots of other professionals that might not be licensed psychotherapists, paraprofessionals, and peer counselors and advocates that could be amazing adjuncts to a licensed psychotherapist practicing MDMA-assisted therapy. And we work in a co-therapy model, so every session has two providers in the room. So we always have one person who's licensed to practice psychotherapy. And then we have flexibility about exactly what the role of the second person is. Is that another psychotherapist who then would need to be qualified to practice psychotherapy? Is it a peer counselor? Is it a support person, like a loved one or a family member that's had some training? Is it a chaplain or a pastor? Is it a nurse? So there's a lot of flexibility there. We do ask that everyone who comes to the training program have 1,000 hours of mental health experience, because there's just no way that we can teach kind of the fundamentals about, providing therapy and counseling.
Okay, good to know. So like the clergy would qualify because of their time working with, people in their parish on mental health issues, that kind of thing.
Yeah. If they had worked on mental health or pastoral counseling. Yeah.
Pastoral counseling. That's the term I was looking for. Thank you. Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
So let's talk about exactly what somebody would go through if they underwent the MAPS training program.
Yeah. and it's good timing. 2020, serendipitously, we decided to take 2020 as a development year, and we still managed to train 300 people online, but really we focused most of our efforts in the last year on building up and creating the next evolution of the MDMA therapy training program. It's been a really powerful program led by Michael and Annie Mithofer, Marcelo Talora, and Bruce Poulter, who have been my mentors and friends in this work. And we've gone from, the training I described in 2014, 7 people in a living room, to cohorts of 60, 70, 90 therapists and professionals to undergo this training. We've trained nearly 1,000 people since the program started in 2012. But when we look forward, we're looking at possibly MDMA-assisted therapy becoming a legal treatment medicine, not only in the US, but in multiple countries, even in as soon as in the next 2 years. So all of that's up to the regulatory process, and our research results have been really positive since then. So we have lots of confidence about that happening, but no guarantee, of course. And so we're faced with kind of health access questions. So if MDMA-assisted therapy becomes approved as a prescription treatment, who's going to provide it? And how many people and which people need it, and who has access to it? These are all very important questions for, launching a new treatment modality, and very common questions that pharmaceutical companies, which MPVC is, would ask themselves at this stage in development. So we think about needing to have a workforce, not only of therapists, of therapy providers, but also prescribers. So we're also developing a separate training program, much shorter, for prescribers, which will probably be, an online course that can take place in a couple of days, in order to give prescribers the information they need to, make informed decisions about patients they would be either referring or prescribing to. And for the therapy providers, we have an extensive training. It's 100 hours. Last year in 2020 was the first year that we did it all online, virtually. And so our model has been that we have training retreats. Previously, it was we would get people together at retreat centers for 7 days, and we would all be immersed for 7 days, and all of the concepts and cases and discussion of the training program. And now that we're doing it online, we kind of split that up, and we have multiple weekends of retreats virtually. We look forward to doing in-person trainings again when we can do that. So over the 100 hours, we have some didactic. We have lots and lots of video case presentations. So we feel very fortunate that because of the clinical work of MAPS and participants who've been willing to lend us their stories to the training program for the purpose of training more therapy providers, we have these really, really rich cases. And that's been fundamental in our program. And that's something that, besides a research entity, training programs wouldn't necessarily have that, right? So because we're doing research, we have these videos of legal psychedelic therapy. And it's been really valuable, especially for a lot of our trainees have been people kind of in the psychedelic bubble, I think you could say. They've been people knocking on the door for decades, hoping that this work would become available, and on wait lists for years and years and years. And that's been amazing. And those are, some of our greatest allies and advocates. But also some of our greatest allies are the people who aren't in the psychedelic bubble, who haven't been knocking on MAPS's door or anybody's door about psychedelics, maybe are even a little bit hesitant to kind of think about psychedelics. And that's been a really valuable experience for us as a program. And so just thinking about some of the people working in kind of certain institutions that their institute might have some hesitance about psychedelic therapy and not know a lot about it. And so when we work with them, it's not just that those of us in the psychedelic bubble are talking about how amazing MDMA therapy is, and we want them to take our word for it. We actually get to have case presentations to show. And when people see those first sets of videos, they're like, we've had people literally say, I didn't believe you until now. I know there's, peer-reviewed scientific papers. I know the FDA has approved this stuff. But I just didn't believe you until I actually could see it with my own eyes, and it's really, powerful just what the medicine does. And in some ways it's a little unfathomable, until you actually experience it. So we feel really grateful to participants who have lent us their stories in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. You brought up such a good point about if you have people who come in with more of a doubting perspective, first off, hats off to them for coming into this training program with an open mind and checking it out for themselves. Now, I know that to participate in this, like actually taking the medicine is not a requirement for the program, but is that something that's offered? Especially, like, I can see it would be helpful for those who have never experienced that themselves, and then they see through it and they're like, oh, maybe to be a better therapist, I'd like to experience this myself. Is that something that they have an opportunity to do?
Yeah, that's a good question and a really hot topic. Should psychedelic therapists take psychedelics themselves or have psychedelic therapy, to be more specific? And what you said was exactly right, that MAPS aims to always make that opportunity available to therapy providers who undergo training with MAPS. So many years ago, I think it was 2009, FDA approved a clinical trial called MT1, which MAPS sponsored, which is a healthy volunteer therapist training study. And it was the first of its kind. In fact, when the clinical operations team submitted the protocol, they thought, well, I'm not sure I don't know if this is going to pass. We really hope it does. And the kind of case for providing MDMA-assisted therapy to therapists is just that in many psychotherapeutic training modalities, many psychodynamic trainings, it's expected that psychotherapists would undergo their own personal psychotherapy. There's only so much you can talk about a thing, watch a thing, listen to a thing without actually feeling the thing to know what it's really, really about. Not from an intellectual point, but from kind of an embodied experiential standpoint. So yes, we don't require it. We do make MT1 available. It was 100 participants, which we've pretty much, I think we're at 95 participants or somewhere in there. We got an extension to enroll up to 120. But when I told you we trained up to 1,000 people so far in the program, 120 spots is not that many, not to mention all the people we hope to train in the future. So MAPS created a similar study called MT2 and wrote the protocol for that, hoping it would be a way to continue that opportunity for people. Unfortunately, the FDA hasn't approved it, and that protocol is in clinical hold, and MAPS is responding with a formal dispute resolution. It's really difficult to do healthy volunteer therapist studies because the FDA thinks about clinical trials in treating a disease. And with phase 1 and 2 studies, you don't necessarily have to treat a disease, especially, in a healthy volunteer study. But the FDA really wants to understand what is the scientific theory or hypothesis that you're attempting to conclude from this study. And I guess ours is, does personal experience make someone a better MDMA therapist? We've had people, we did a survey of about 70 therapists who work on the MAPS protocols and who had done this experience, MT1. And we asked them, did you think that this better prepared you for your work delivering MDMA therapy? And a majority of them did. I think it was around 2/3 or more. And almost all of them said that the experience was valuable for them personally. So we hope to make that available. It's very difficult given the legal status and how clinical research happens.
Yeah, well, thank you for explaining that. That's very interesting. I had not thought about you have to make a trial so that the people who are going to be in your other trials can try the thing they're going to be trialing. So complicated. So thank you for everybody at MAPS and all the tireless work that you guys put into making all these things possible. That is amazing.
Yeah. And I'll say one more thing about it. I mean, ketamine is a really interesting example. So ketamine is legally available as a prescription medicine. It's used off-label for major depressive disorder. And there are many ketamine training programs out there teaching people how to conduct ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. So a lot of ketamine is getting prescribed. Not a lot of it is ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. And so these training programs are kind of burgeoning. And some of the training programs actually do provide trainees with their own personal medicine experience if they're, medically eligible and interested in pursuing that. And so that's an interesting kind of example when you're able to write an off-label prescription in order to support someone's, it doubles as supporting someone's professional growth as well as being a prescription treatment for them personally. So we do get curious, what does that look like if MDMA therapy gets approved? Would there be training programs where people can have off-label treatments? Certainly many therapists do have PTSD and could qualify, for a primary prescription as well.
That's a very good point. And I know that Canada, for example, with Therasil, they've gotten people with end-of-life issues psilocybin, but then they also get, I think, 17 or so practitioners the ability to try it for themselves so that if they end up being the people facilitating for the others, then they have more of that firsthand experience. And then also it gets bound to the basics, like you just said, like taking care of ourselves first before we try to take care of others. It's like, please heal the healers. That's a great background for us to be healing from, to understand how to heal our own traumas and then go in and help others. And so I definitely hope that your MT2 gets approved, and also, like you said, that these ketamine programs that are exploding, that provides a great model to show how that can, just giving it to the therapist and having them work through their own process can be really beneficial. Speaking of these other substances, I wanted to ask you, so if somebody's considering, okay, which of these training programs should I go through? And okay, MAPS has this MDMA training program. Do you believe that the skills learned in that program may translate to other substances? Psilocybin being, like you said, different in the hallucinatory, but same in length. And then, ketamine being different in length. Like, if you could talk a little bit about how you think those skills would translate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I do think there's a lot that's translatable and overlapping. And I think it really speaks to a lot of these modalities as they exist in our Western medical world today. We're really built off of, you can kind of trace back some of their lineages, and only some of the people that I'll mention are, transpersonal psychology, Jungian psychology, Stan Grof's work, Leo Zeff's work, Sasha and Ann Shulgin, certainly influenced by indigenous cultures and traditional practices from all various regions. And the list just goes on and on and on. So regardless of which of these medicines you're kind of talking about, when you think about kind of client-centered practices, it's kind of difficult to not want to pull in. There's some spiritual and traditional ritualistic practices that have influenced all of these modalities. And when we're talking about working with non-ordinary states, that's not something that our modern world created. We didn't make non-ordinary states in a lab. In some cases, I guess non-ordinary states do grow out of the ground. But working with non-ordinary states is a very, very old process that humans have been doing. So we kind of owe it to our ancestors and the ancestors of this earth, that those traditions have built on. And so when it comes to those kinds of competencies, how to work with non-ordinary states of consciousness or extraordinary states, having self-awareness, being able to be grounded, managing and regulating one's own kind of psyche and emotions, working with an inner healing intelligence or a spiritual intelligence that facilitates healing process, having curiosity and practicing mindfulness, all of those things kind of translate across these different medicines. And those are all competency kind of categories we focus on in our training program. I think when you get to some of the differences, again, for us, it's a lot more focus on the relationship between the therapist and the participant. And just like relational healing. So when participants are going through the study, MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, there's a lot about their relationships in their lives, relationships to perpetrators, relationships to family members, relationships to the therapist, relationships to culture and society, relationships to loved ones, intimacy, vulnerability. So that is a major theme in MDMA therapy. And so we have a lot of emphasis on that, what specifically therapists need to know in addition to their basic training for MDMA therapy.
Very cool. You're right. I can understand how that all the non-ordinary states do have a lot of those things in common. So yes, MDMA brings up some certain things, but the other things seem to be very, very translatable to the other medicines that will hopefully also be looking at FDA approval in the near future, or some that already
Yeah.
here, like ketamine. Can you tell people how they can sign up? What is the process for applying for the program?
Yeah. So we're actually about to open enrollment for our newly evolved MDMA therapy training program in early March. So that's a good time to be kind of pursuing an application or to look for updated web content. And that can be found at mapspublicbenefit.com, mapspublicbenefit.com, and it's pretty clear to navigate to the therapy training page. So there we have information about the training program, the qualifications and application requirements, our tuition and scholarship programs, and our application link. We'll be posting our schedule for 2021 very soon.
Nice. And can you talk a little bit about the scholarships that you offer, please?
Yeah. I'll say just a little bit because there's about to be a public announcement, but as we think about, access and equity, MAPS is very dedicated to leveraging, its supporters and the people who donate to MAPS to support access. And when you kind of trace back, it's access for patients to be able to afford and, physically get to places where the therapy would be provided. It's access for clinics to be able to understand what they need to pursue this treatment and to be able to offer it in their clinics. It takes some modifications for a lot of clinics. So many therapists, for example, are in private practice. Some doctors are working at institutions or clinics that might not be set up to offer 8-hour therapy sessions. So it's takes a lot of collaboration. So. And then it's also for therapists, therapy providers, and prescribers to be able to access and afford training. So we have a health equity program. That's a 3-year program that's launching this year. And like I said, I won't say too much about it because there'll be public announcements about it coming out shortly. But we're really excited about what that's going to be able to support in terms of subsidizing therapists coming into the training program, subsidizing the expense of supervision fees, subsidizing some of the expense for clinics to start up, and then also going into a patient access fund.
Okay, fantastic. We will, if this comes out after the show notes and this episode launches, we will update the show notes with that information.
Great.
For sure.
Good.
Absolutely, absolutely. I am so grateful for you coming on and for sharing all of this with us. It's such a commonly asked question, and so I plan to do a few different episodes with the different programs, but I'm so glad that we could start off with MAPS, kind of the OG, in MDMA. And so, Shannon, is there anything else you'd like to tell people where else they can go and find your work and more about the training?
I think mapspublicbenefit.com, and to sign up for the email newsletter there, we put out a monthly email newsletter specifically for the training program, and we're always publishing about other programs, free events, workshops, online events. So we really encourage people to go to mapspublicbenefit.com and sign up for the training email newsletter.
Perfect. Thank you again, Shannon, for coming on. I truly appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn Marie.
Absolutely. All right. For everybody else out there, until next time.